My name is Adam Blackwell, the Vice President, International Development Services Group. And on behalf of the team at the Global Terrorism Trends and Analysis Center, I will be trying to moderate this session. For those of you who don't know us, GTTAC was created by DSG and our partners at George Mason University's Terrorism, Transnational Crime and Corruption Center, led by Dr. Louise Shelley, to support our contract with the State Department to develop a database of global terrorism incidents to prepare the annual Annex of Statistical Information on Terrorism, which we delivered happily last night, and to help prepare and edit the congressionally mandated country reports on terrorism. We do this with a combination of technology, data collection, and a team of well-trained, multilingual, and multicultural data analysts, many of whom are listening today. This is a continuation and a series of talks by eminent people in the field of terrorism. If any of you listening would like to present in a future opportunity, please let me know either via the chat function in Zoom or email. I should state that the views expressed here are those of the speaker. Dr. Daisy Muibu is an assistant professor at the University of Alabama in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. Her research is focused on policing and counterinsurgency from a variety of perspectives that include police legitimacy and local law enforcement, responses to terrorism, citizen perceptions towards formal, private, and informal policing, and paramilitary forces, and the role of foreign fighters within insurgent groups. Dr. Muibu received her PhD in Justice Law and Criminology from American University in Washington, D.C., and her Master's in Intelligence and International Security from King's College London. Daisy was also Peace and Violence Research Fellow at AU's School of Public Affairs Department and a recipient of various research grants, including the United Nations Initiative on Peace and Reconciliation in Somalia, the Association for the Study of the Middle East and Africa, and the American University Doctoral Student Research Scholarship. Dr. Muibu also has years of experience working on rule of law and criminal justice reform, as well as counterterrorism in regions of Kenya and southern Somalia. Dr. Muibu will speak for 20 minutes on the history and status of extremist groups operating in Somalia and the ongoing counterterrorism threats. This talk is highly relevant. As I mentioned earlier, we just completed our 2020 Annex of Statistical Information, and according to our data, Somalia and Al-Shabaab are once again in the top 10 countries and perpetrators for this year. Al-Shabaab having committed 477 incidents, terrorism incidents with over 1,400 fatalities and countless other wounded and other harms. It's a personal delight to introduce Dr. Muibu, as I spent 3 glorious years in Kenya and have very fond memories of traveling to Somalia in what was a very, very difficult time in the early 90s. So please get your questions ready. We'll be using the Q&A function in Zoom. We'll then have about 20 minutes for hopefully a very interesting dialogue with Dr. Muibu. I would just say, please prepare your questions as she's speaking and enter them in the system so we don't have that gap of silence while we wait for questions. So Daisy, with great pleasure, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So today, the agenda would be that for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to briefly give an overview of the history and current status of Al-Shabaab and the Islamic State in Somalia. We'll then discuss a little about the counterterrorism efforts in the region, and I will end with talking about some of my own personal findings from my own fieldwork research. Now, when we think about Al-Shabaab, there's some disagreement about when Al-Shabaab was actually formed, but there is some recognition that the group existed in some form as part or as a component of the Islamic Courts Union, which emerged in 2003. And reports suggest that the faction of the ICU that later became Al-Shabaab was hiding and protecting Al-Qaeda operatives. And as a result, we see the group started facing international and regional concerns. And so this accumulated with the Ethiopian intervention in the region in December 2016 against the Islamic Courts Union, and as also an effort to prop up the transitional federal government. Now, the Islamic Courts Union was defeated with rapid speed, but we see that Al-Shabaab emerged from that initial conflict, more organized, regrouped, and declared its independence around 2007. Now, we find that between 2007 and 2010, Al-Shabaab managed to gain territory and a significant amount of supporters around this period of time. But we find that around the fall of 2010, some of its fortunes begin to shift. We see that some battleground failures or defeats start exposing existing rifts within the group's leadership. And we see these rifts continue to be further exacerbated by some of the group's territorial losses between 2011 and 2013. Now, the group did manage to have Al-Qaeda publicly endorse its alliance in 2012, but we see that these internal divisions accumulated into a purge between 2011 and 2013, orchestrated by the group's leader, Godane. He made moves against certain high-profile members of the group that he was in disagreement with, and we see that there was a lot of high-profile assassinations or pushing out of other key figures of Al-Shabaab. So by the end of 2013, the Al-Shabaab managed to, consolidate control of a smaller but less restrained form of Al-Shabaab and managed to conduct attack also against the Westgate Mall in Kenya. Now, we see that over 2014 and 2015, Al-Shabaab starts to face some losses, right? We find that the group's leader, Godane, is killed in an airstrike in 2014, and it ends up being replaced by Abu Ubaidah. And at the same time, in 2015, we see that Mumin, or this individual known as Abdul Qadir Mumin, pledges allegiance to al-Baghdadi, effectively breaking away from his northern Al-Shabaab unit and bringing approximately 20 Al-Shabaab fighters stationed in Puntland with him. And as a result, the Islamic State province in Somalia emerges in its pre-province form around October of 2015. But despite these setbacks, we see that the group, Al-Shabaab, still manages to conduct some high-profile terrorist attacks over 2016, 2017 as well. And this includes the Al-Ade attack against the the Kenyan military base in the Gedo region. We see the Dala airport laptop bomb. We see that they even managed to kill a US Navy SEAL member in the Bari region, and also the major attack in Mogadishu, which they didn't really claim responsibility for, but resulted in over 500 deaths. Now, over 2018, we see that the Islamic State itself also starts to expand its operations in terms of its operational tempo. It's not as big increase as we see compared to Al-Shabaab, but we have to remember that the Islamic State was sort of ramping up its activities from a relatively lower base. But nevertheless, we see that these operations begin to expand in 2018. And in 2019, Al-Shabaab also continues to ramp up major terrorist attacks, whether we're talking about hitting targets within Kenya, in the case of the Dusit D2 attack, or also the Balidogle military airfield attack that injured a US service member. And in 2020, we see Al-Shabaab conduct even bigger attacks. We see this happening with the Manda Bay attack, the sort of being one of the more latest US fatalities in January of 2020, where Al-Shabaab hit the Manda Bay naval base in Kenya, killing 3 US security personnel members. And we also see that in the same year, in December 2020, the Department of Justice here in the United States unsealed an indictment of a Kenyan national for conspiring to hijack an aircraft on behalf of Al-Shabaab in order to conduct a 9/11 style attack. And we hear that this individual was arrested in 2019 in the Philippines. And if we try to zoom in a bit closer into Al-Shabaab for 2020 and 2021, we see that the group did face a lot of counterterrorism pressure. Right, we see this in the form of airstrikes and other military setbacks. See that it's also facing competition from the Islamic States and reported leadership divisions, especially concerns about Ubaidah's health. Nevertheless, the group has managed to remain remarkably resilient over this time period, maintaining a robust operational capacity. We see this in the fact that it has conducted over 30 suicide bombings inside of Somalia over 2020. We see this also due to the fact that the group has managed to conduct major high-profile raids of military bases, not only in Kenya, but also within the Somalia against Turkish, Somali, and US military bases. We also see this in the fact that in March, they managed to extend the activities up to Bosaso with the central prison attack. We see this again with the fact that the group maintains an extortion ring that goes beyond its immediate territorial control and into areas such as Kismayo and Mogadishu. We also see that the group has managed to increase its operational tempo in Kenya since 2017. And we see this largely because of what some of the politicians in Kenya have mentioned, particularly the Mandera County Governor, Ali Roba, who recently stated that Al-Shabaab currently controls vast swaths of the country's northeastern counties. And we also see that the group has managed to expand its activities more northward, even hitting closer to the Galmudug capital, Dusamareb. And so these are all worrying signs of the group's expansionist capabilities and its ability to hit targets. And we see this with the more recent message to Djibouti, whether or not, which sort of raises alarms and tells us to be concerned about its potential ability to hit that region. When you think about the Islamic State, on the other hand, over 2020, the group's operational tempo decreased slightly. The Long War Journal claims that the group conducted roughly 4 attacks per month, but a lot of these were not verified. And this raised some questions about whether the decrease was due to al-Baghdadi's death and the Islamic State's central misfortunes. And the answer, or also could it, the answer really tells us that it's not really the case, right? The group has faced significant setbacks and personnel losses over 2020. And this largely came from the Puntland Security Forces operations and significant raids that they conducted against the group over the time period. We also see that the group has been weakened by Al-Shabaab's attacks in the region. And so all of these factors accumulate to mean that Islamic State's operational tempo has sort of decreased over 2020. But this doesn't mean we should keep our eye off the group. The group still remains capable of conducting attacks. Right? We see this in its expanded activities, not only north of Puntland, but also south of Puntland in areas like Beledweyne and Mogadishu. We also see that it has maintained its significant taxation, whether it's in Bosaso or in the rural areas of Puntland. And we expect that these activities will likely increase around this electoral period in Somalia. For now, I want to switch over to talk a little bit about the counterterrorism efforts. When we think about counterterrorism in this region, I like to distinguish it between the broader national efforts and the more regional focused efforts. So when we think about the broader national efforts, we know that there is a broad international coalition of actors that are engaged in supporting the ongoing counterterrorism efforts in the country, and can see that there's a number of different groups that do so. But the question is whether there has been significant progress in the fight against Al-Shabaab from these broad international coalition. And the answer really is that it's not quite the case. The military engagement has delivered some operational and tactical successes, including killing several high-profile Al-Shabaab fighters and limiting the group's ability to conduct a large-scale attacks against AMISOM and the Somali forward operating bases. But the military effort has not been successful in significantly altering the strategic terrain of the conflict and breaking the stalemate that has existed since roughly 2016. And we can't talk about this stalemate without also discussing the more regional efforts to counter terrorism in their region. Now, as you know, Somalia has adopted a federal system and because of this federal posture that it has adopted, we see that the constitution provided provisions through the national security architecture that was adopted in 2017 and the new policing model to create a two-tiered security structure within the country, where you'd have forces at the federal level and also forces at the regional level. And for this reason, we see that there is now emerging regional police forces that exist in certain member states. And in addition to these regional police forces, we also see that several of the federal member states have established their own statutorily established military forces. Specifically, we see this in Southwest State, right, which created a Darawish in 2015, which is later relabeled the Special Police Force. We see this also in Jubaland and Puntland, which both have their own military, more militarized forces in both regions. Now, there are some potential benefits of having these federal military forces, and some scholars and other observers have noted that these forces are, because they are closer to their communities and they tend to often be garrisoned in the places where they're recruited from, this means that these Darawish forces have community bonds that mean or that help it retain some significant potential to counter the threat posed by Al-Shabaab. Right, and we can see that this is demonstrated a little bit in some of the activities we see in Jubaland, with some of its Darawish forces managing to push up northward into regions controlled by Al-Shabaab or closer to those regions. And we see that this being the case in the Islamic State in Somalia in terms of the Puntland forces' successes against that group. But there's still concerns about these regional forces. One being the fact that there is this broader tension between, because of the lack of political settlement between the relative roles and powers of the federal government versus the federal member states. And because of these existing tensions between the federal government and federal member states, we see that the federal government fears that the federal member states will have their own armies, and this would threaten the authority of the central government. And on the other hand, you see that the federal member states fear that the federal government would likely interfere or is interfering in local matters or regional matters. And this encourages them to maintain their own separate military capabilities. Now, ultimately, this presents a dilemma for those donors that we mentioned earlier, or that broad international coalition of partners. On the one hand, they can offend the federal government, who is their key partner in fighting Al-Shabaab, by choosing to bypass federal government authority and working directly with these regional Darawish forces. And that could really hurt their relationship with their key partner in the fight against Al-Shabaab. On the other hand, they may be losing out on an opportunity to support more locally legitimate and combat-capable forces, which may improve chances of defeating Al-Shabaab. Now, this situation is further compounded by the reality that several different security assistance activities exist in the country, but that these activities lack unity. As a result, you have various security forces existing across different federal member states, but with different loyalties, capabilities, and priorities. Scholars like Colin Robinson have successfully been able to map out some of the forces, and you can see here that they're a diverse range of different forces, and I'm happy to discuss this further at the Q&A section, but you can see that the assistance and support vary, and the consequence of this is that these different priorities and loyalties have exacerbated political fragmentation between the federal government and the federal member states, and also undermine progress towards broader state building and broader efforts to build more longer-term, stable and capable security institutions in the region. Now, a discussion of the counterterrorism efforts in Somalia is not complete without discussing the political situation right now in Somalia, particularly the standoff around the election. Now, a little bit of background is that there exist tensions between the more centralist and federalist approaches to politics and security in the country, and concerns that the federal government is trying to attempting to illegitimately undermine regional state governments' autonomy. On the other hand, it's the federal government perceives some of the regional actors, particularly regional states like Jubaland, as potential threats to its to the more central authority of the government. And so these tensions have been exacerbated by the current political standoff regarding the elections. And this has brought the country closer to the brink of war than we have seen it before. Right, the political agreement agreed in September has fallen apart, and there's no consensus on the way forward. And this is quite unprecedented given the fact that even in the past, where timelines and deadlines around elections have been fungible, there's always been a plan. But in this case, it doesn't seem to be a plan. And we're seeing that President Fred Marjo's term ended or expired in February 8th, and the opposition now declares the government as illegitimate. There have been clashes between federal government and opposition protesters. And more recently, I think as of March, we see that the opposition candidates have teamed up with some federal member states, largely Puntland and Jubaland, to come up with this National Salvation Council against pretty much the guest right now is the former president, Farmajo. There are other concerns that we should also keep in mind when we're thinking about counterterrorism in this effort, in this region. And that really concerns the US troop repositioning, which occurred in January 15th, as well as other broader regional dynamics, notably Ethiopia's drawdown in areas such as Gedo Bay, Bakul, and Hiran due to its current engaged conflict in the Tigray region in northern Ethiopia. We also see strained relations between the federal government and Kenyan forces and the breakdown of diplomatic ties between the two of them. And the fact that other external actors, including the Gulf states that could potentially complicate the political situation and undermine counterterrorism efforts in the region. And lastly, another matter that we need to keep our eye on is this idea that AMISOM, in terms of its reauthorization up until December 31st, seems to be following, prioritizing the handing over of security responsibilities to Somalia security forces more increasingly, especially in this new posture around the Somali transitional plan. The question is, are the forces ready to be able to hold that responsibility? And because of these existing tensions in the region, there has been and the stalemate in the conflict, there has been questions about potentially negotiating with Al-Shabaab and whether that is possible. And you can see that there was a US attempt to negotiate, possibly, reportedly Christopher Miller, then director of the National Counterterrorism Center, apparently traveled to Doha in October 2020, where he reportedly sought Qatar's assistance to marginalize hardcore Al-Shabaab members connected with Al-Qaeda, right? But we know that though there wasn't really any realistic prospect of success for this plan, there are arguments to potentially negotiate with Al-Shabaab. Some people have argued that because of the stalemate of the conflict, we should negotiate, that there's precedent in other areas such as Afghanistan to suggest that we should engage in negotiations, and that often, despite Al-Shabaab's refusal to engage in any dialogue, at the micro level, the group tends to indirectly negotiate with the federal government and other actors, using clan elders as interlocutors and facilitators. So this could be an avenue. But any discussion with negotiations with Al-Shabaab must first need to rectify the political tensions that exist right now between the federal government and the federal member states. And it also needs to consider what this means for other regional actors, what it means for international partners, such as the US, and also what it means for Al-Shabaab. Would they be in a position where they'll be willing to negotiate? And also, what does this mean for foreign fighters that exist in the region, largely regional foreign fighters from neighboring countries like Kenya? What does it mean for these individuals when it comes to negotiating with Al-Shabaab? Now, I'll close off briefly by talking about some of the findings I found from my own fieldwork that informs this study. Between 2019 and 2020, I had the opportunity to work on a project that was evaluating more state-level police forces. Now, through the National Security Architecture New Policing Model, there have been programs that have been launched to support and monitor the establishment of police forces in 4 different cities spread across Somalia. And what we did is that we went in and we tried to interview locals and survey locals to understand how they actually perceived the police forces in these regions that were newly introduced and whether these perceptions had changed over time. And what we found in some of the surveys that we conducted is that in places like Baidoa, for example, there was a decline in public trust and confidence in the police forces in these areas shortly after the 2018 elections. And so that when you look at the data over time between 2018 and 2020, we see that initially perceptions were high and people felt that they trusted the police, but these declined over time. In the case of Johar, we see that the attitudes remain generally unchanged and that individuals remained trusting and confident of the police. Similarly, in Beledweyne, initially there was distrust in the police, and then over time, trust improved. But it was very clear that from the communities that they didn't feel that the police truly represented them, and that the police little engaged with the community members in those areas. And the reason for the lack of representation is not surprising given the challenges that were faced with recruiting police officers in Beledweyne, in the region, especially at the broader political tensions that were occurring at the time. And lastly, collected data in Kismayo, in Jubaland. And what we see is that attitudes generally remained unchanged. People generally were trusting of the police and confident in them and felt that they represented them and from relevant local clans. But the events of 2019 around the Jubaland elections around the time, as well as the existing political tensions that persist to date, the individuals felt that there was a deterioration in security due to the political instability, and many also mentioned increased Al-Shabaab activity in the area. So I ended up personally being more interested in zooming into one of these case studies to really piece apart public perceptions. And so I ended up focusing more on Kismayo. And I wanted to understand a few things. I wanted to understand, what did the public think of these forces? There's this broader argument that these more local forces, particularly the police and Darawish, are more locally appropriate. And so I wanted to know, are these forces legitimate in the eyes of the public where they operate? Because the argument seems to be that they'll be more, have more communal ties with the community, so they should be more legitimate in the eyes of the public. I also wanted to know, if they are legitimate, why are they legitimate in the eyes of the public? I was also very curious to know why the public would choose to cooperate with these forces and why they would choose to empower these forces with more authority. Because the narrative that is coming out of some of those who suggest that these forces are more locally appropriate is that because they're appropriate, people will be more willing to share intelligence with them and want to empower them with more authority to provide protection. And what I found was very interesting. I conducted a survey of 323 individuals in Kismayo. And I found that through quantitative analysis and field interviews that yes, they are considered to be more legitimate. And the reason why is because the public felt that they were more engaged with the community and more procedurally fair. They felt that the force had good clan representation and so was able to distribute services fairly, that they were capable of tackling crime and disorder, and that they were more lawful in their eyes. And they engaged not only in formal forms of law, but also abided by the Her customary practices. And when it comes to why would they cooperate with the police, it seems that these same factors came up. Procedural fairness seemed to be what was statistically significantly what moving people to choosing to cooperate and empower the police. Their preparedness, particularly the militarization of both the Darawish and the police, seemed to encourage greater cooperation, as well as the clan representation within the force. And so this led me to wonder, well, I want to look at the other side of the coin. How about the police? What do the police think? There's this big broad push to establish the police forces in these regions to ensure that they have more closer communal ties. And because of having these closer community ties, they should be able to function better. And so I went ahead and collected in 2020 a survey of 176 officers out of the 544 that existed in Kismayo. And I had a single question to ask is, how does their experiences with more community engagement and community-focused policing shape their ideas of counterterrorism and their views on it? And I also found, what I found was also quite interesting. I found that officers that have this more experience with community-oriented policing styles were not only more likely to think that the forces that had more intelligence and informant cultivation practices, such as the Jubaland Intelligence and Security Agency, are better suited to countering terrorism, but they felt that these other forces, such as AMISOM or the Somali National Army, that are less suited. Seeing them as being a bit too broad and being a bit too short-term in their activities and not focused on more long-term security initiatives. So I ended up concluding that the findings do suggest that there's arguments that local level forces can be more locally appropriate and effective, but that more research is needed because I just have this one zoomed in snapshot of one region. Otherwise, I will stop there and see if there's any questions for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daisy. That was a wonderful presentation. You answered many of the questions I was going to ask as you went along. I just remind everybody, please enter your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. Daisy, I have to say before we start questions, Somalia doesn't seem to have changed much in the last 30 years. Still many of the same old problems and issues. So the first one is from Dr. Louise Shelley, and it's how is the funding generated for the expanded activities that you have described? What forms of illicit trade? So I guess the expanded activities of the terrorist organizations, Al-Shabaab and ISIS.
Al-Shabaab and the Islamic State, both of them, right? Well, for the case of Al-Shabaab, it seems to be the extensive network of taxation. And it seems that they're not only able to tax the localities where they have control over, but they can be able to have a reach and tax areas that they don't immediately have control over, particularly areas that were previously considered to be very secure, such as Kismayo. You can see that there's been an increase in taxation in those regions, as well as even in Mogadishu. And these taxations look very different in different places. In some cases, it's through more willing taxation, sort of communities who are a bit more empathetic with the cause, who are giving money. And in some cases, it's through intimidation and other reasons. But it seems that it's that network of taxation that is a big draw-in of money for the groups. And you see also in Islamic State, it's the taxation in the more rural areas, as well as in Bosaso, and also the fact that Mumin's subclan, he still has connections with that subclan in the Puntland region, which provides some sort of support for the Islamic State.
That's a good segue into the next question, which is, does Al-Shabaab raise money through taxation, which you have already answered, but I guess then the subtext is, do they operate as a quasi-state? In other words, do they provide services, and try and generate trust within the areas in the population that they control?
Yes, certainly. In fact, that's perhaps one of the lasting powers of Al-Shabaab. The reason why they've been managed to sustain themselves is because of their ability to provide alternative services, especially areas where the state has provided inferior or just no services at all. Most notably, you see a lot of narratives around the justice provision by Al-Shabaab and anecdotal accounts of people leaving government-controlled areas to seek out Al-Shabaab Sharia courts, because we know that the justice there would be more quicker, effective, and useful. In fact, there was a project that we did in that same study we had of the 4 different cities. We also asked individuals questions about their court preferences and why they would take certain cases to certain courts versus others. And they seem to be a justice shopping angle for the community members. And Al-Shabaab seemed to be viable for certain cases in terms of their ability to provide thorough and useful justice. In terms of it being a quasi-state, yes, I think that has been a continued argument, at least within Somalia, is whether or not Al-Shabaab is this global jihadist organization that is trying to have broader international goals, or has it become more or increasingly domesticated and conducting more quasi-state activities? And it seems that both are somewhat true. The group is still very internally focused, still providing a lot of services, still operating in that quasi-state framework. But as you can see from the events such as the DOJ revelations, is that the group still has these broader international ambitions, and its attacks in the regions like Kenya, its sites on Djibouti, seem to be suggesting that they may still have this more regional and broader goals. But I think all of them are still in self-service of some of its more domesticated and local interests.
I think you may have answered this Daisy, but in my experience in South America with drug cartels, quite often they provided better services than the federal government or local government, and became, embedded in the social fabric of communities. So it was even more difficult for legitimate government, or if that's the word, to try to replace them or move them out. Is that more or less the same situation in Somalia?
Yes, it is more or less the same. And it's not that Al-Shabaab's provisions are so, great. It's just comparably to what the state is providing. Sometimes they provide a more consistent and reliable form of services than what the state is providing. And so that's also a very strong idea. It's very similar to what you're suggesting occurring with the drug cartels. Yes.
Well, continuing on this theme of funding, the next question is, Al-Shabaab remains active generating revenue, and according to the Mogadishu-based Hiral Institute, Al-Shabaab collects over 5 million a month from Mogadishu. In your opinion, why has this group been able to continue generating this huge amount of money, which of course allows them to continue to be among the most resilient terrorist organizations in the world?
In my opinion, the reason why Al-Shabaab has been very successful is that they manage to have a strong way of infiltrating not only government agencies, but also maintaining a reach in areas that they don't have immediate control over, whether it's taxing businesses through intimidation or manipulating clan interests in their favor to get access to other regions. It seems as though the group has been quite successful at doing that. In the case of Mogadishu, I think a lot of factors play into it, right? I know there's strong recognition that Al-Shabaab has a strong network of infiltrators, right? And very good at maneuvering the political and security situation to take advantages of openings in tensions that exist, to take advantage, tensions that exist politically, to take advantage of openings for them to gain a foot into any particular region. So I think its ability to be politically savvy with the clan tensions that exist in the region, coupled with its ability to infiltrate areas that it doesn't have control over, really do explain its ability to maintain taxation networks in places like Mogadishu.
Excellent. There's the next question again, following in on this funding. There have been reports that Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, Libya, Syria, and Yemen are funding Al-Shabaab. How true do you think these reports are, and how much do these external funders change Al-Shabaab's internal focus?
I have to admit that I've heard the same, but I haven't followed up enough on that to be able to speak on it. So I think, unfortunately, I may not be in a good place to say how much is coming from those areas compared to its local taxation and the rest. But I have heard similar rumblings around that. But unfortunately, I'm not really confident I can speak to that very clearly.
Okay. Next question, how has Al-Shabaab procured arms and explosives? Who is backing and sponsoring the group? I guess another question on funding, but also procurement.
So in terms of arms and explosives, I can speak more to the explosive aspects. It seems that the explosives are not necessarily always very specifically sophisticated in their design, but more sophisticated in their deployment. And that's a very important distinction to make, because then you find that they're using a lot of easily attainable, equipment to be able to construct their IEDs, right? So, pulling together things that you can necessarily find that are readily available in Somalia, that anybody can quite honestly purchase to be able to construct their IED weapons, rather than having very sophisticated weapons, such as what we've seen with the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen, which is sort of had a bit more, there was a bit more sophistication to their IEDs. Comparably, Al-Shabaab doesn't necessarily have that. Of course, the Dalo Airlines attack is a bit of an anomaly when it comes to all of this, But when we think about how its weapons look like, especially its ID capabilities, it's using materials that are very easily accessible. I believe there was a War on the Rocks article. I forget the exact author's name, but he did a really good job of sort of tracking how Al-Shabaab's ID capabilities are developed within the country, and sort of arrived at a very similar conclusion that it wasn't necessarily very sophisticated.
Okay. Then just remind the group, we have a few more minutes for questions. So if you have one, please enter it into the Q&A function. Daisy, the next question is, how has Al-Shabaab changed their tactics in response to this changing strategic conditions in the country and I guess of war?
So over time, we see that they've adopted more guerrilla-like tactics. I think if you look at it like prior to when they were still part of the ICU, they sort of, some of those fighters that had fought in Afghanistan, they came back, sort of brought in some of what they had learned, as well as those Al-Qaeda East Africa operatives also introduced some newer tactics, more classic ideas of terrorism and guerrilla war-like tactics. But we see that after the Ethiopian intervention, the group sort of reverted back to more guerrilla-like style tactics, right? So more surprise operations, and over time, they started building up their ID capabilities. It seems that the group has always been a learning organization, so they adopted more ID capabilities, more ambushes in their attacks, increased assassinations. You're seeing, especially over 2020, we saw a lot of suicide attacks and the use of assassinations against key figures. So it seems that the group is very capable of adapting to increased terrorism pressure, especially in the form of sort of in the form of the drone strikes. I think one of the most interesting things I heard recently is the fact that the organization is also very well organized within itself. So leadership decapitation isn't really a strategy that is very effective against them. So other than, you know, all what I've already mentioned in terms of the more guerrilla-like attacks or the use of suicide bombings, the group itself has organized itself in a way that there's always someone capable of replacing a leader that has been killed off. So it seems that leadership decapitation isn't really consequential on the long term in terms of disrupting, it just disrupts the group's activities, but it doesn't necessarily quash the insurgency.
Yeah, this is, the next question is one I was actually going to ask. You know, part of the response to the, I'm going to say, civil war and famine of the early 90s was fairly comprehensive immigration policy, and there are a lot of Somali expatriates. Has Al-Shabaab been able to reach into that community for influence, fundraising? You know, what's the relationship with the expat community?
Could you explain it a bit more? What do you mean by expat community? Do you mean?
Well, the Somalis living in the United States or Canada or the UK, okay, or whether they, regardless of when they moved. I'm just wondering what's the relationship between Al-Shabaab and how do they operate, if they operate at all?
What I know the most is to do with foreign fighters. I'm sure there's perhaps other angles to it, but I can speak to the area that I've done more research on, which is when it comes to foreign fighters. And we know that during the time when Al-Shabaab was part of ICU, there was a call to invite more foreign fighters to come to the region. And we saw a lot of individuals coming from Western countries who are of Somali origin into the country. And immediately after Ethiopia's intervention, I know that was a big moment to galvanize and call for more foreign fighters to flood into the region. And that's where we saw more Somalis but who were living abroad travel into Somalia to fight alongside Al-Shabaab in the conflict. So that's what I'm mostly familiar with, those support. And there was arguments that these foreign fighters were relatively more successful at sort of mitigating their foreignness, because often foreign fighters have a hard time going into different conflicts that they don't necessarily have the same immediate identity connections, but given the fact that clanship and kinship ties could allow a Somali individual from to sort of travel into the country more easily. So that's sort of the connection that I'm aware with. I know there were also concerns. I think you can look up some of the indictments against such as Somalis in areas like Minnesota who have been, either were caught before they were choosing to travel to Somalia to act as foreign fighters, or that they were caught because they were trying to send some funds through their kinship ties. So that's what I'm generally familiar with.
Daisy, I have one last question for you. It I guess comes again from personal experience. We've spoken a lot about Somalia, but what's the impact been on Kenya, and how do you see the Kenyan government developing a more rigorous, coordinated approach to this problem?
Yes, I think there's a lot of questions with regards to Kenya. I think you'd have to think about Kenya's interests, which is largely in the Jubaland region, right? Because it sees that area as sort of a buffer state. But we can see that Kenya's intervention in 2011 has sort of invited more retaliatory attacks, or an increase in attacks from the Al-Shabaab against the Kenyan, within the Kenyan country. And we see that in the northeastern region, especially, there's increased attacks by Al-Shabaab, and now we're seeing that there potentially could be a strong Al-Shabaab presence in the region that is sort of holding territory across the northeast. So I think on the Kenyan side, the priorities is one, to make sure that they have built and propped up a strong Jubaland state that is willing to work alongside them. And I think this is perhaps one of the strongest tensions that it has with the federal government of Somalia, which sort of led to these diplomatic rifts. I know Kenya recently, I think it was last week or so, sort of say that they're going to shut down all of two of the major refugee camps in Kenya itself. We're not too sure if that's in response to the tensions that exist with the federal government, but in terms of what Kenya could do better moving forward, I think it's too late for a pullout. I think Kenya's already involved in the conflict, and I don't think it would be strategically important for them to pull out of the region. But I think it would be how they're going to be able to negotiate their relationship between the federal government as well as any regional state that is present in Jubaland. And that's a difficult thing to do especially given the very tumultuous political situation right now. But Kenya needs to be able to coordinate not only with the Jubaland authorities, but also with the federal government effectively if they're going to deal with the threat posed by Al-Shabaab, especially given the fact that a lot of foreign fighters and sort of inspired attacks are occurring in Kenya.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muibu. That's the end of our session for today. Ironically, on April 1st. I'd like to wish everybody who's listening and you happy Easter. And hopefully we can stay in touch. We all love your mug and hope we can have some of that going forward. Anyway, thank you very much, Daisy. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening in, and stay tuned to hopefully our next session, which will be coming soon. So thank you very much, everyone.
Take care.